Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the editors and contributors of Strategy Page discuss current events and other military-related topics with a splash of history. I'm your host, Dan Masterson. Joining us today is Jim Dunnigan, editor of Strategy Page, well-known military author, and acknowledged pioneer and innovator in board war games. Also joining us today is Austin Bay, associate editor of Strategy Page, military author, columnist, and retired Colonel, U.S. Army Reserves. Welcome, Austin and Jim. I'm going to start out with you today, Austin. Could you talk a little to asymmetric warfare and where it's headed?
Well, look, there's several definitions of asymmetric warfare. Usually, it's cast in something where you're dealing with a very weak opponent who is able to handle a counterattack, surprise. Anything involving surprise is arguably an asymmetric, a form of asymmetric warfare. But warfare is based on gaining an advantage and asymmetry. One belligerent versus the other belligerent, and so again, the terminology has become in among defense analysts, intelligence analysts, and the like, slanted towards the weak taking on the strong. But strength, when you think about it, so it's like Stalin's line: "Quantity has a quality all of its own." And you're seeing Putin try to show that Stalin had a point right now with all the human wave attacks in eastern Ukraine. But strength would be an asymmetry. Now, in current discussions, cyber comes up repeatedly because in many ways it's a known unknown. What cyber is going to do? It's going to do something. We know that cyber attacks have the potential of they can shut down communications. We don't know how, and Jim's written extensively about this. Jim has a jaundiced view of the apocalyptic analyses of what a cyber attack would do, but it is going to have effects. And suddenly, a side, and I'll take the United States here as the victim of this type of or the target of this type of asymmetric attack. If you've relied heavily on global positioning satellites and rely heavily on sending information through satellites to electronics, but guidance and both sensors and your shooting elements that are relying on it, and you can blind them, whether it's cyber or taking down a satellite. You've negated what is regarded as a superpower's advantage to be able to put precision weapons within 2 to 3 meters of whatever the intended target was, almost any place on the planet. So that would be an asymmetric attack using, well, again, even though I started out talking about cyber, I said you could be doing it with kinetic weapons, taking out satellites, taking out relay drones. In other words, taking out key elements of the communication and sensor and targeting system. And is it asymmetric, or is this just another form of what talented, prepared warriors have been doing to one another since there were really organized warfare? Let's take an example too of electronic intelligence. A recent one being that, excuse me, Ukrainians catching conversations by Russian soldiers on their cell phones. And they're calling back to Russia to talk to their families, their friends, or communicate among themselves, and using that as targeting information for artillery, long range rockets. Is it an asymmetry, or just having a common sense and capability to be able to pick up those conversations and then use the positioning data or on the ground data to be able to whatever it was. The Russians had said, I think 68 or 70 people were killed, and the Ukrainians said they took out, one figure I saw, over 300 Russian soldiers with that attack that was supposedly instigated by intercepting the cell phones. Electronic intelligence and asymmetry was created by Admiral Nimitz when Navy intercept picked up Japanese signals. They were able to decode it and know that the target was Midway. So Nimitz went about setting up his ambush to ambush the Japanese, a much more powerful fleet at the time. But the surprise attack that Nimitz organized for the Battle of Midway was based on something the United States could do, which was intercept the Japanese code and break it. And the Japanese didn't have that same capability. Again, that is something that's done now. Now, small scale, I'll give you an example of something that I think is qualifies in the Ukraine war as an interesting asymmetric, and that is the Ukrainians' ability to operate in very successful, small, combined, armed, and dispersed groups. That's proven to be a real advantage over the Russians. But what goes into that, Dan? The fact that they've got Stinger and Javelin teams with very successful fire direction control teams, and then also mixed in with that are what are essentially light infantry backed by some light armor and occasionally tanks. How did that come about? Came about the hard way, fighting Russians in the Donbass after 2014. They figured out this is what they needed to do. They didn't want to take on Russian armored columns straight on. And then they looked at, some of the tactics early in the war, asymmetric, knocking out the lead vehicle and knocking out the rear vehicle. That's what the Finns did to the Russians and in the Winter War. And of course, the Finns had a built-in asymmetry, which was that terrible terrain that the Russians tried to punch through. Eventually, they did when they knocked Finland out of the war. But the terrain was an asymmetry. So I'll let Jim talk about it. If I sound like I've got a classicist view of asymmetry, I do.
Jim, so what are your views on asymmetry that are different than Austin's?
Well, it works both ways. Both sides can adopt, an asymmetric form of warfare. China has been particularly, how should I put it, clever in coming up with ways to counter the asymmetry. For example, their use of the balloons. They're moving at about 20,000 meters, in what they call near-Earth orbit. These are not just for intelligence collection, but they can also be fitted to basically act as low-flying positioning satellites. And China has already been experimenting with, and we've seen this, sending up satellites which disperse, I think 7 or 8 or more smaller satellites, which are apparently intended to knock out communications or GPS satellites. Now, if you do this, the enemy is forced to improvise. China has its own Baidu satellite network, so they can knock out the American GPS and still have their own Baidu. Russia also has their GLONASS, so they can do the same thing, but they haven't got the capabilities, the material, as it were, that the Chinese do. I mean, the Russians have basically reduced their status as a near-peer adversary with their wasteful tactics, as Austin pointed out, getting obliterated by the Ukrainians, and they're still getting hammered by the Ukrainians, but they're not giving up because, again, they're following as Austin pointed out, the old Stalinist mode, quantity as a quality all its own, up to a point, because this is in Stalin's time, and what we're seeing is a lot more Russians do not want to be the quantity to make up for the lack of quality. And in Stalin's time, you didn't have a lot of people, avoiding military service. As Stalin pointed out, you have to be a very brave man to be a coward in Russia. That's no longer the case. People are really, taking a powder, as it were. They're getting lost. They're not getting mobilized. So the Russians aren't able to mobilize the troops they used to be able to mobilize. And they are trying to fight a long war, but they cannot fight a long war unless they can muster enough people to keep their end of the war going. So that's another form of asymmetry. The Ukrainians want to get the war over as quickly as possible. They're running into problems because the Russians have always emphasized continued, lobbying of the larger NATO allies, especially France and Germany and even the United States, for example, to try and stop these allies from sending tanks to the Ukrainians, because they know the Ukrainians, no matter what kind of tanks you give them. I mean, you see all sorts of excuses. Well, they can't handle the M1. Well, they can handle the M1. They've handled everything else we've thrown at them. They don't expect the tanks to last forever. They just have to last long enough to basically knock the Russians out, as it were. And that's what the Russians are confronting. Now, if the Ukrainians are, and the Russians expect this, assemble a force of over 100 or 200 M1s and Leopards, in the next few months, the Russians are in big trouble because they have no counter for that. They haven't got the anti-tank weapons that can handle these tanks. Like I say, these are Western tanks, aren't designed like the Russian tanks. They aren't as vulnerable, and they're far more powerful. They're more reliable. So the Russians are facing a problem, which I don't know what their solution is going to be. They're certainly not going to surrender. But the Ukrainians are willing to account our victory as pushing all the Russians out of Ukraine. And this is what's really getting the NATO allies to supply them with all they need, because they know this war will go on and on, costing them the arm and a leg until the Ukrainians can achieve their objective, which is actually the objective of everybody, to eliminate the Russians from the Ukrainian territory they occupy. The reason for this is very simple. The Eastern NATO members, Poland, the Baltic states, and what have you, and the new ones, the ones that are trying to get in despite Turkish interference, like Finland, they also understand that if the Russians win any kind of territorial concession and victory in Ukraine, they are next. The Poles, are in particular realize, the Russians will come after them. The Baltic states are much more, vulnerable. They're smaller. The Russians will chop them up if they get the chance. So for them, they keep the pressure on the farther away NATO allies that, look, we got to stop them. We got to do it. We got to give the Ukrainians what they need. We supply the weapons. They do the fighting. I mean, nobody wants to come out and say that, but that's basically the deal. Even the Ukrainians don't say it in quite those words, but that's what it comes down to. So it's a battle of will, but it's also a battle of politics. Like I say, the lobbying. Trying to keep the Western allies, a little more reluctant to supply the Ukrainians what they need. The Chinese, though, have learned from this. But the Chinese have one disadvantage. They don't really want a war. The Chinese government the Chinese Communist Party, which rules China, they only stay in power if they can keep the economy going. Right now, the economy is not doing too well. If there's a war, even if the Chinese are doing well, their economy will be shut down. Millions and millions of Chinese will be out of work. They will be unhappy with their government. And this is something China has never had to worry about. Well, they actually have had historically. If you've got enough of your own people against your war effort, you've got to end the war. So, it's the asymmetry is you've got asymmetric tactics within asymmetric tactics within asymmetric tactics. That's confusing after a while. But that's an advantage too if you're a little more on the ball about what's actually going on than somebody else. But that's what the United States has to keep in mind with China. You don't have to defeat China in a naval war. And we've got a piece coming out on the logistics problems, with sustaining a offensive in the Western Pacific. The Chinese are the largest shipbuilder in the world now. At the end of World War II, well, in the 1930s, by the end of World War II, we were the largest ship manufacturer. We had the largest fleet. We could build more ships quickly. Now it's China that can do it. But China, we could sustain losses in World War II. We had rationing in the United States, something a lot of people forget. China really is already in a state of rationing. They're already in a state of crisis internally. And a war would push that from crisis into, government change. So the asymmetry is a weapon that has to be applied in many different ways. It's basically a weapon. It's an arsenal of weapons, and the way you apply it, when you apply it, how you apply it, and so on, determines how you're going to win. Like I say, the Chinese are using their balloons as a backup for lost satellites. They take out our satellites. We haven't got the balloon system. They do. They have an advantage. But again, they can't afford a war. That's one thing you've got to understand about the China. The Chinese, and that's Sun Tzu. That's ancient Chinese military strategy. Look strong, be threatening, but don't attack. An attack is very expensive. If you cannot afford the expense, you automatically lose if you have to attack. And the Chinese are very conscious of Sun Tzu, and they follow his strategies. Russians, the Chinese feel the Russians are stupid. They basically destroyed their military power in Ukraine. Even if they managed to hang on to some Ukrainian territory, they're no longer in near-peer power. The economic sanctions, which China has not violated that much, they've taken advantage of them. China is now the major power in Central Asia. Before the war, it was Russia. The Central Asians, they used to be part of the Soviet Union. They were familiar with the Russians. They traded with the Russians. But now the Russians are nothing. And the Chinese are there with their money, with making deals, what have you. The Central Asians go with what their economies need, not what Russia needs. And China needs more economic clout in Central Asia, and they're getting it. Even in Afghanistan. They were very reluctant, before to move into Afghanistan because the Americans were, controlling the government. Now the government is basically run by a bunch of religious fanatics. They're screwing it up. They're even more vulnerable. So the Chinese can make deals and simply point out to the Taliban government, look, if you screw this up, you're dead. Your people are starving this winter. There's not enough food. We don't give anything away. That's another big difference between the Chinese and the Russians during the Cold War. During the Cold War, the Russians gave stuff away. The Chinese learned from that. You don't give anything away. You come in, you have aid, people are starving. Well, we can give you food, but we want something. And now in the West, that's cold-blooded. I mean, that's not ethical. Ethics, schmetics. The Chinese are looking out for themselves, and that gives them a tremendous advantage. I mean, that was basically what the Japanese and the Nazis did during World War II. Morality, ethics, screw it. We're out to get what we can. And early for the first couple of years of the war, that worked for them. But eventually it backfires. But sometimes eventually never comes. and those victories become permanent, and that's what the Chinese are looking for. So you have to understand your enemy. They don't fight the way you fight, and that's the ultimate asymmetry.
Austin,
Dan, let me pick up.
go ahead.
Yeah. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Oh, I was going to say that when I start off on my classicist intro, Sun Tzu is really about gaining advantage. That's the best description of his work. And Jim was pointing out that Sun Tzu's advice, really he doesn't want to get into combat. It's a part of a couple of chapters talking about how expensive everything is. You want to look strong. Yeah, you want to be strong. So the guy to make a mistake and make the mistakes, and that's that's part of when he says that you need to understand yourself, and then understand your enemy, know your enemy, and know yourself. But his advice is always ultimately about creating an asymmetry, either whether it's tactical, operational, strategic, or diplomatic. And there is a diplomatic asymmetry working out in Ukraine now. Something that we talked about at least 5 or 6 times, which is Russia's not just fighting Ukraine, it's fighting Western Europe and North America. And in some ways, if you follow the munitions stockage, they're also fighting South Korea, Japan, and Australia, and other sources were sending 155 millimeter shells, not necessarily to Ukraine, not directly to Ukraine, to American stockpiles. Huge. It's not just big bad Russia picking on little Ukraine. They're taking on the wealthiest nations in the world, minus China, is what it amounts to. Because I'll see, I think if you went through it, you'd find that 9 of the 8 of the top 10 economies on the planet in GDP are supporting Ukraine in either directly or indirectly. That's an asymmetry. It's not just it's an economic asymmetry, and it becomes a technological asymmetry when Ukraine starts receiving, and has already been receiving, these modern weapons and modern munitions, like the multiple launch rocket system and HIMARS. Now, Jim wrote something not too long ago about how everyone wants HIMARS. Why? Because it works. Give the U.S. Army credit for developing that rocket, and I think it came out of Missile Command in White Sands and Redstone Arsenal. Tremendous system, and it does have efficacy in the Pacific. The Marines have already shown you they put a HIMARS on the deck of an amphibious assault ship, and now they got a cruiser. At least in terms of the firepower that HIMARS or the MLRS version can deliver. An extended range. Now you're getting up to where the missiles can hit 70 to 100 kilometers, and actually even more with some of the new extended range rockets. I understand what the actual, Jim may have a better insight on what the range is, but the range is supposed to be jaw-dropping. 150 kilometers.
150 kilometers, yeah.
It was 150. I knew I read that. It's just, that's an asymmetry, Dan. They were worried about long-range Russian artillery. Now they've got this pinpoint rocket system, the guided munition. Of course, it can be interfered with, but it's also got internal guidance, so that it's not relying on the satellites. Doesn't have to rely on or redirection. That gets into a tactical asymmetry. So warfare is winning warfare has always been about an asymmetry. And as I've said before, look, a surprise attack is an asymmetric attack. Pearl Harbor was an asymmetric attack because the United States was caught completely off guard. And the Japanese did it by being very stealthy in the way they moved their fleets. And really in the September of 41, that's when their deception plan kicked in. So everybody thought that the Japanese, when they made their move, they were going to move south, Philippines, and go to Borneo and Java and take control of the oil fields, which that's what they need. They need the resources. They're not going to risk coming for Hawaii, but they sure enough did. And they had a very sophisticated deception plan that created that asymmetry. Right out of Sun Tzu is what it amounts to. It's right out what Sun Tzu said, and he wasn't first to say it. As Jim said, Sun Tzu was collecting the wisdom of Chinese commanders since 1200 BC, 1000 BC, and he's in around 500 BC when he puts it together. Yeah, it's poetry in some places. In some places, as Al Nofi pointed out, I had him come to when I was teaching that history class at University of Texas, honors course. Nofi shows up and says, Sun Tzu's not just about creating an advantage and all that. There are parts of it that are like a field manual that are dated, where he talks about when you see this, that means light cavalry on the flanks. He says that's like a modern field manual. But what everybody wants to look at are his concepts of thinking through a situation, immense preparation, and then at the same time, what you're trying to do, you want to accomplish it diplomatically or economically instead of actually having a fight, which is something that Jim points out, was pointing out earlier.
So, Jim, often the general public thinks about asymmetry as, the United States facing a foe like the Taliban. What are the current preparations in the United States and other large countries to face smaller foes?
Well, the smaller foes never win. I mean, they never win anything substantial. That's the problem. You cannot eliminate them. As the Islamic terrorists, especially ISIL, say, we're not afraid to die for our cause, or kill for our cause. We're not afraid to die for our cause. And they enthusiastically, embrace that literally, as with the suicide bombers and what have you. Now, that was not invented by by ISIL. I mean, the Hindu, what do you call it? Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka, yeah, the Tamil Tigers.
Yeah.
They use that. They blew up some aircraft and what have you. They also killed a Indian prime minister, but it didn't win them their war. I mean, they eventually prevailed inside Sri Lanka, but at the same time they managed to dissuade India from getting involved. India felt Sri Lanka was their little semi-independent kingdom off the southern tip of India, and the Tamils wanted to prove otherwise, and eventually they did. But that war went on for a long time, and in many respects, it's still going on. Some of these wars, you've got to remember, are forever wars. They never really end, and that's, for example, that's what's happening with the Russian Empire. The Russians, they believed, because some Western or American think tank said, we have to take Russia apart. Well, that was never a serious war plan. It was just some guy saying, well, what if? Well, what if we just totally, took Russia apart? Well, Russia took that as the current NATO war cry. Well, it isn't worth it. Russia is weak enough as Russia is, but Russia felt no. We have to basically defeat NATO, which is impossible, and we have to take Ukraine because Ukraine is part of Russia. Well, they've given up on that, and they finally declared war. And that, like I say, isn't encouraging a lot of Russians to join. They have state-controlled media, which for a long time, the opinion survey showed, supported the war or, the special military operation in Ukraine. Well, now it's finally been declared as a war to rescue Russia from being, taken apart, and most Russians aren't buying it. And so Russia has a real problem. They've lost whatever credibility they had internally, and they want to keep this war going. So that's not going to end well. But the Ukrainians and the Belarusians, the Belarusians, in terms of popular opinion, are anti-Russian. But Lysenko, the dictator, the guy who's really started as a reformer, they all do. But since the mid-1990s, he's basically been a dictator. And the only thing that's been propping him up is Russian troops. They're not there to aid Ukraine, Belarus. They're there to keep their man in power. Because the minute they withdraw that support, boom, Lysenko is gone, and Belarus is in the same, mental space as the Ukrainians. And that is the sort of thing that keeps a lot of these wars going. The empire, like Iran or Turkey, is another one. These are the three empires we pointed out many times earlier in Strategy Page. Are empires trying to put themselves back together again. Some empires, the end and the the core of those empires said, yeah, all right, empires are all over. France, they kept tabs with their colonial, former colonial possessions in Africa, but it was mostly economic aid. They just felt, hey, we're still in touch. We were enemies, but now we're friends, yada, French culture and what have you. Britain had a somewhat similar situation with their empire, but the Indians were very, very, angry about, whatever, the British occupation, the British Raj, as it were. And the British don't care. They say, all right, we'll do what we can. We're willing, but we have no intention of trying to, build that empire that would have lasted for about 100 years. And basically, after World War II, the accountants, told Churchill, we can't really afford it, sir. And while he was figuring out a way to do it, the Labour Party came in and, got him bounced out of office. But in some empires, basically it's economics overcomes everything else because empires are expensive. Unless you can make the empire pay for itself, which is the reason why Afghanistan was never a real country. It was always, when the Silk Road was still around and there was money to be made in maintaining your portion of the Silk Road, you could basically tax, whatever was coming through. You would assure the caravans were safe as long as they paid. So it was worth hanging on to. And for a while, one part of, eastern Afghanistan was run by a Hindu, prince, as it were, and the Iranians, the Persians, basically took the western portion. But the minute the Europeans found a way to build better ships, more efficient, shipping to the Far East, the Silk Road lost all of its economic importance, and that brought enormous changes, throughout the Central Asia. That's why Afghanistan became a semi-country. They basically agreed among themselves, the tribes, who were not willing to become, the subjects of any one ruler. But they said, look, we'll establish a kingdom of Afghanistan, which it was until 1970 something. But the only thing the kingdom will do is keep the foreigners out. And so the king was always a member of the largest tribe, what are they? The Pushtun. But basically, his main job is just to keep the foreigners out. But then some of the city folk, decided, well, communism is the way to go, and it's basically been downhill ever since. But the empires are basically empires that are trying to reform are a constant cause of problems. So you've got the Chinese Empire, the Middle Kingdom. You know, most people don't realize that the Chinese word for China, okay, my Mandarin pronunciation sucks. But anyway, it means Middle Kingdom, and it means the sovereign of all that it surveys. Now, until recently, that meant land, properties, not the sea. But now China has got a big navy. They're basically taking, possession of the South China Sea. They need the oil coming in, et cetera, et cetera. They're no longer how should I put it, a local problem. They're an international problem. So what do? The Turks, the earthquake will set them back a little bit. They were trying to, reestablish their empire. The Arabs said, no, thank you. And resisted it, with great force. The Iranians, the same thing. Thank God most empires, that have tried to revive have stumbled and collapsed and found out the empire business is more expensive than they can afford, and they basically back off. But in the process, it causes a lot of problems for everybody. And this is something you've got to understand. Because the United States was never an imperial power. We were an economic power. We were basically trying to protect our economic interests, not rule foreign countries, but simply to allow free trade to continue, which was beneficial to the country both countries, the United States and the country they were trading with. Now, if you didn't want to trade with the United States, all right, no big deal. If you want to live in poverty and isolation, some countries prefer to do that. Afghanistan, for example, until they decided, well, let's go communist and become a proper country and get really screwed up, which is precisely what they did. So this is the kind of asymmetry that basically makes the world go round, usually in fits and bumps, and the ride can get very rough at times. But it's really what it comes down to. What is good for me? If you're basically pragmatic, willing to take your losses, you can go along and do fairly well. But if you get ambitious and your ambitions outrun your capabilities, you're in for nothing but trouble. And that's what we're seeing in so many parts of the world.
Well, that's a good point to stop. Thank you. And we'll talk to both of you next time.
Okay, till then.
Bye.